Hey church, this is Pastor Ben again. In a previous video, I had explained to you something about the timeline of biblical history and where we're sitting with our series in Kings when it comes to the history of Israel. And so I kind of gave you a general timeline. It's still up here now, starting with creation all the way till today. And a couple of things that we tried to point out on this is the gaps of time that we're talking about. They're a lot greater sometimes than we realize. And so I added to this one the fact that Columbus sailed in around 1500 AD. And if today we're now in the 2000s, there was 500 years ago that Columbus had discovered America. And so something to think about is that the destruction of Jerusalem that had occurred around 600 BC, and Jesus at around, we said 0, even though there's no year 0, is about the same amount of time. So Jesus is as much removed from the destruction of Jerusalem as we are from Columbus. Likewise, David is another 500 years before that. And so there's twice as much time between between David and Jesus and between us and Columbus. Some other key events that occurred in this time period after Jesus is the fall of Rome, for instance, was around 500 AD. Again, another 500 years after Jesus and 1500 years removed from us. So there's a lot of time involved when we start thinking about it in terms of our own modern history and then look at the history of ancient Israel. The time that we're talking about with the kings is between 1000 BC and around 600 BC when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. And so if we take this and expand it out, and we look at the time of David, which was about 1000 BC, like we said, and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in around 600 BC, and we start with David here, and then we go to Solomon, his son. We have about 80 years in this time period. David ruled for 40 years and Solomon ruled for 40 years. This is considered the golden age of Israel. This is when Israel reached the peak of its power. And the Bible will tell us that they influenced or held sway over an area larger than they ever had, from Egypt all the way up through Damascus into to touch the Euphrates River far to the north. That Solomon controlled that whole area. But after Solomon, things really fell apart. So at this point, the kingdom is split. One side goes with Jeroboam, and the southern kingdom is controlled by Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So now you have two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is called alternatively Israel or Ephraim, after the strongest tribe. So 10 of the tribes break off from Israel and follow Jeroboam in the north. Two southern tribes stayed together, and that would be the tribe, and that nation was eventually called Judah, and their capital was in Jerusalem. So we have the capital of Jerusalem over Judah, and in the northern kingdom, it's the capital of Samaria. Samaria is a term we ought to be familiar with from studying the New Testament, because the area where Samaria was would eventually also be called Samaria later, and you'll hear the Jews talk about the Samaritans being people that they didn't really care for because they were a mixed race. This kingdom carried on for quite a while until 722 BC, when it was destroyed by the powerhouse called Assyria. There were several large empires that grew up during this time period. The first really major one was Assyria. And God used the Assyrians to come down in 722 BC and destroy Samaria. And all the Jews who were living in the northern kingdom of Israel were carted off to various parts of the Assyrian Empire, and other people were brought in to live in what was at that time Israel or Samaria. And that continued all the way up until Jesus' day. This sometimes is where we get the idea of the 10 lost tribes, that there were 10 tribes of Israel that were lost, and there's all kinds of mythology around what ended up happening to them. It's quite simple. Nothing happened to them. In fact, we have in the New Testament multiple situations where someone is said to be from one of the original 10 tribes, including Paul himself, who was a Benjamite. There are the tribe of Asher, the tribe of Issachar, all these different people that are discussed within the New Testament who were from one of these 10 tribes. So there is no such thing as the lost tribes or the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Judah continued for some time more until around 600 BC when the Babylonians came in and destroyed them. So we've got Assyrians and Babylon. Assyria and Babylon that destroyed those kingdoms. So I want to read something to you from Kings. This is found in 2 Kings chapter 17, and it's about the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. The writer says, "All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Now you remember one of the things we talked about in our last video was that the Exodus under Moses was the pivotal point of Israelite history. It was the beginning of the nation. It was the thing that the prophets pointed back to over and over and over again to say, listen, all these things that are happening to us, have completely forgotten what God did for us back in Egypt. And again, they appealed to the Israelites to listen to God, to not forsake God, not to turn away from their idols because of what God had already done for them previously in Egypt, and to not forget that. The New Testament also talks about the same thing. It says over and over again, listen, you've been freed from sin. You've been given freedom in Christ. Why would you go back and be a slave again? Why would you ever forsake Jesus and what he's done for you on the cross? And so the similar imagery you'll see used over and over again to warn us not to be like the Israelites who had completely forsaken the God who had already saved them once from their slavery, to not turn back to those worthless idols again. The same warning applies to us. Thank you so much for your attention. We'll have more videos coming, talking more about the history of Israel. So stay tuned, and God bless you, and go be the church.